The Valkyrie Confederacy had ruled the Orion Spur for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never known true fear until now. Their crystal ships were beautiful things, grown over centuries from living minerals that sang with energy. And these vessels had protected their people through countless small wars and border conflicts. But nothing had prepared them for what was coming. The swarm had appeared from the dark spaces between galaxies 6 months ago, and since then, 17 civilizations had fallen to its hunger. Ambassador Kethril stood at the great window of the observation chamber and watched the distant stars, knowing that somewhere out there, 1 billion hungry mouths were racing toward his homeworld. And he felt his twin hearts beating too fast beneath his translucent skin. His species had evolved on a gentle world of soft rains and warm oceans, and they had never needed to develop the killing instincts that other races possessed. So they had focused instead on art and science and diplomacy, building a civilization of peace that had lasted longer than most species existed. Now the peace was about to be devoured. Ambassador, his aide said quietly, "The Galactic Assembly is ready for you." Kethril turned away from the stars and walked through the curved corridors of the station toward the great chamber where representatives from 100 species waited. And with each step he felt the weight of his people's survival pressing down upon his narrow shoulders. The assembly chamber was a vast dome filled with floating platforms, each one carrying delegates from different worlds. And the air hummed with translation devices, converting 1,000 languages into something everyone could understand. Kethril took his place at the central podium and looked out at the gathered representatives, seeing sympathy in some faces and cold calculation in others. And he knew that what he was about to do would shame his ancestors, but shame meant nothing if his people were dead. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. "I come before you today to make a request that no Valkyrie has made in 12,000 years. He paused and felt the attention of the chamber focusing on him like a physical weight. "We need help." The chamber remained silent, but Kethril could see the reactions rippling through the crowd. Some delegates leaning forward with interest, while others pulled back as if afraid his desperation might be contagious. "The swarm will reach our core worlds within 40 rotations," he continued. "And our fleet, though brave, cannot hope to stand against their numbers. So I am here to beg, yes beg, for any species willing to send aid." The silence stretched on, and Kethril watched hope die a little more with each passing moment. The Rithani delegate, a massive creature of stone and fire, shook its head slowly, and the crystalline elders, who had seen empires rise and fall for millions of years, looked away with what might have been regret. But none of them spoke. They were afraid, Kethril realized. And he could not blame them, because the swarm had consumed species far more powerful than the Valkyrie, and no one wanted to draw its attention. He was about to step down from the podium, his mission a failure, when a voice came from the back of the chamber. "Earth will assist." Every head turned toward the small platform where the human delegation sat, and Kethril felt a strange mix of hope and confusion wash through him. The humans were new to the galactic stage, having discovered faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago, and most of the elder races considered them primitive children who had barely learned to walk among the stars. A woman stood on their platform, her dark hair pulled back from a face that showed neither fear nor hesitation, and she wore the gray uniform of the human military with a simple confidence that seemed almost out of place in the Grand Chamber. "Commander Sarah Chan," she said, speaking on behalf of United Earth Command. The Rithani delegate rumbled with what might have been laughter, and several other species exchanged looks that clearly questioned the sanity of this young race. "Commander," the crystalline elder spoke, its voice like wind through broken glass. "Do your people understand what the swarm is? Because this is not a border dispute or a trade negotiation. This is extinction. Chine smiled. And something in that smile made Kethral's skin flicker with colors he could not identify. We understand perfectly. Elder, she said, Earth has reviewed all available data on the swarm. And we believe we can help. You believe, the Elder repeated. And what forces do you intend to send against 1 billion bioships, young one? Because your entire species has been among the stars for barely a heartbeat. We will dispatch a relief fleet immediately, Chun replied, her voice calm and professional. Though I should warn the Assembly that most of our military forces are currently engaged in operations elsewhere, so we can only spare the 3rd Reserve Fleet. Kethral felt his hope crumble into dust. The reserves. He thought, and not even their primary reserves, but their 3rd reserves, which meant they were sending their oldest ships and their leftover crews. The scraps that no one else wanted. The human was still talking, explaining logistics and travel times. But Tethral barely heard her because he understood now that this offer was not salvation, it was a gesture. A symbolic show of support from a young species too naive to understand that symbolism would not stop the swarm from eating every man, woman, and child on Velcari Prime when the assembly session ended. Kethral returned to the observation chamber and stood once again at the great window. Commander Chun found him there an hour later. Ambassador, she said, I wanted to speak with you privately before we depart. Kethral turned to face her, and he found that he could not keep the bitterness from his voice. You are sending your reserves to die alongside my people, he said, and I suppose I should thank you for the gesture. But forgive me if I find it difficult to feel grateful. Chun was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. Ambassador, I understand your doubt, and I know how this must look to you. But I want you to understand something about humanity. She moved to stand beside him at the window, and together they looked out at the vast darkness of space. 60 years ago, we were alone on our little world, convinced that we were the only intelligent life in the universe. And then we discovered that the galaxy was full of ancient civilizations with technology we could barely comprehend. She paused, and Kethral saw something strange in her eyes, something that burned like distant fire. Every species we have met has told us to be patient, to learn, to accept our place as the youngest children in a very old family. And we have smiled and nodded and done exactly that. Her voice dropped lower, and Kethral felt his skin prickle with an emotion he could not name. But here is what none of you seem to understand about humans. Ambassador, and I tell you, this not as a threat, but as a simple truth that you will see for yourself soon enough. She turned to face him, and her smile was gone now, replaced by something harder and older than her young face should have been able to hold. We did not survive our world by being patient, and we did not claw our way to the stars by accepting our place. And when the swarm comes for your people, you will learn what the 3rd Reserve Fleet really is. She straightened her uniform and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back over her shoulder. Get your civilians to the shelters, Ambassador, and tell your fleet commanders to stay out of our way. Then she was gone, and Kethral was left alone with the stars and a strange, new feeling growing in his chest. He was not sure if it was hope or terror. But for the first time since the swarm had appeared, he found himself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to these young humans than anyone had ever suspected. 40 rotations. He thought, and then we will know the truth. He turned back to the window and watched the stars, waiting for the end of everything or the beginning of something new. The hyperspace rift tore open above Velcari Prime like a wound in the fabric of reality. And from that wound came the ugliest ship's ambassador Kethral had ever seen. He stood on the observation deck of the orbital station with Admiral Sorth, the commander of the Velcari Defense Fleet. And together they watched the human vessels emerge one by one into normal space. There were 40 of them, And not a single one was beautiful. The Valkyrie grew their ships from crystal over the course of centuries, shaping them with song and light until they became living works of art that could sail between the stars. But these human vessels looked like they had been hammered together from scrap metal by creatures who had never even heard of beauty. They were gray and angular, covered in weapons that jutted out like the spines of some poisonous creature. And their hulls were marked with scars and patches that spoke of battles fought and damage never fully repaired. Those are their reserves? Admiral Soroth asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. Earl could only nod, because his throat had gone too tight for words. One of the ships, larger than the others, and bearing a name painted in white letters that his translator identified as Constellation, moved to the front of the formation. And Kethrol could see that entire sections of its hull were different colors, as if pieces had been replaced so many times that no one had bothered to match the paint anymore. A communication channel opened, and a human face appeared on the view screen. The man was old by human standards, with gray hair cut short and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who was angry at the stone. And his left eye was not an eye at all, but a piece of metal and glass that glowed faintly red in the dim light of his bridge. Admiral Marcus Webb, the human said, 3rd Reserve Fleet. Reporting for duty as requested. His voice was rough like gravel being dragged across metal, and when he spoke, Kethrol noticed that several of his teeth had been replaced with something silver. Admiral Webb, Kethrol replied, trying to keep the despair out of his voice. We are grateful for your assistance, but I must ask about your vessels, because they appear to be somewhat. He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. Aged, he finally said. Admiral Webb laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound, more like a bark than anything expressing joy. These old girls? He said, and something that might have been affection crept into his rough voice. Yeah, they've been around, and the Constellation here. She saw action at the Belt Wars back when I was still a lieutenant, and she has been patched up so many times that I am not sure there is any original hull left. He gestured at something off-screen. The Fury of Chicago survived the Titan siege, and the Relentless got her name changed 3 times because she kept outliving the admirals who commanded her. And every ship in this fleet has a story like that. Admiral Soroth stepped forward, his crystal armor catching the light. And your crews? He asked, what manner of warriors do you bring to our defense? Webb's organic eye moved to focus on the Valkyrie admiral, and for a moment something dark passed across his scarred face. My crews are veterans, he said. Men and women who have seen things that would break most people, and some of them left pieces of themselves on battlefields across human space. He held up his own hand, and Kethrol realized with a shock that it was not flesh but metal, each finger crafted from gleaming alloys that moved with perfect precision. We are the ones who got too broken for frontline duty, Webb continued. The soldiers they did not know what to do with, and so they put us together in the 3rd Reserve and gave us the ships that nobody else wanted. Kethrol felt his heart sinking lower with each word, because this was worse than he had imagined. Earth had not just sent their reserves. They had sent their wounded, their discarded, the warriors who had been used up and thrown away. Admiral, he said carefully, I do not wish to seem ungrateful, but perhaps you do not fully understand what we are facing. He activated the tactical display, and the space above the console filled with red markers, each one representing a swarm vessel. 300,000 bioships, he said, carrying billions of warrior organisms, and they have destroyed 17 civilizations, some of which were far more powerful than my own people. He turned to face the human on the screen. You have brought 40 ships and crews that you yourself describe as broken. So I must ask, Admiral Webb, do you truly believe you can make a difference here? Webb was silent for a long moment, his red artificial eye fixed on the tactical display. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Becoming something harder and colder. "Ambassador," he said, "let me tell you something about broken things." He leaned forward, and the scars on his face seemed to deepen in the shadows. "I lost my eye at the Battle of Ceres when a plasma round punched through my helmet. And the doctors saved my life, but they could not save the eye. So they gave me this one instead." He tapped the metal socket surrounding his artificial eye. "This eye can see in 12 different spectrums. It can calculate firing solutions faster than any computer I have ever used. And it never gets tired or loses focus." He held up his metal hand again. "I lost this hand pulling 3 of my soldiers out of a burning transport, and the replacement they gave me can crush steel and feel the vibration of an enemy footstep from 50 meters away." His lips pulled back in something that was almost a smile but held no warmth at all. "Every broken person on these ships has a story like mine. And every patch and scar on these vessels represents a battle they survived when they should have died. So no, Ambassador, we are not what you wanted." He stood up from his command chair, and Kethril could see that one of his legs was metal too, gleaming beneath the fabric of his uniform. "But we are what you need, and when the swarm arrives, you will understand why Earth sends its broken soldiers to fight its hardest battles." The communication ended, and Kethril stood in silence with Admiral Sorth, neither of them able to find words for what they were feeling. Finally, Sorth spoke. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should do as the humans suggested and get our civilians to the shelters." Kethril nodded, still staring at the tactical display, where 40 human ships hung like gray ghosts against the starfield. "And our fleet?" he asked. "What should we do with our ships?" Sorth was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was thoughtful in a way Kethril had never heard before. "The human admiral told us to stay out of their way, and I find myself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in my military career, I should follow the orders of someone who is not my superior." He turned and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at Kethril. "There is something in that human's eyes," he said. "Something I have never seen in any species we have encountered. And I do not know if it is madness or something else entirely. But I know that I do not want to be between those ships and the swarm when they meet." Kethril remained alone on the observation deck as the hours passed and the civilian evacuation began, and he watched the human fleet take up defensive positions around his world. They moved with a coordination that surprised him, each ship knowing exactly where to be without any apparent communication. And he realized that these crews had fought together so many times that they no longer needed to speak to understand each other. As the first distant sensors began to detect the approaching swarm, Kethril found himself thinking about what Admiral Webb had said about broken things. Perhaps, he thought, there was something to be learned from a species that took its damaged warriors and its scarred vessels and sent them to face impossible odds, or perhaps this was simply the final act of a tragedy, and he was watching 40 ships full of wounded soldiers sail toward their deaths. Either way, he would know the truth soon enough because the swarm was coming, and nothing in the galaxy could stop it, nothing except, perhaps, 40 ugly ships full of broken humans who refused to die. He watched them moving in the darkness, and for the first time, he felt something that might have been hope. The swarm arrived like a tide of darkness rolling across the stars, and from the observation deck of the orbital station, Ambassador Kethril watched 300,000 bioships blot out the light of distant suns. They were horrible things, each one a living nightmare of chitin and claws, grown from the consumed flesh of 17 civilizations, and they screamed as they came, a sound that traveled through space on frequencies that made Kethril's bones ache with primal terror. The Valkyrie fleet hung back as Admiral Sorth had ordered, their crystal ships forming a defensive ring around the planet. And in front of them, small and gray and impossibly fragile looking, the 40 human vessels held their position. "They are not retreating," Admiral Sorath said, his voice filled with disbelief. "The swarm outnumbers them 7,000 to 1. And they are not retreating." Kethral watched the tactical display as the human fleet began to move. And what he saw made his twin hearts skip their rhythm. They were not falling back or spreading out to avoid the incoming wave of death. They were accelerating directly toward the heart of the swarm. All ships. Admiral Webb's voice crackled across every communication frequency. Calm and steady, as if he were ordering dinner rather than charging into certain death. Weapons free. What happened next would haunt Kethral's dreams for the rest of his life. The human ships opened fire, and the void of space erupted into chaos. They did not use elegant energy beams or precise graviton pulses like the Elder races. And they did not rely on shields or careful tactics designed to minimize losses. They used violence, raw, brutal. Overwhelming violence. Railgun rounds the size of small vehicles tore through swarm vessels at speeds that Tethral's instruments could barely track. Each impact punching clean through one ship and continuing on to strike the one behind it. And the kinetic energy released by these impacts was so intense that nearby swarm ships were torn apart by the shockwaves. Alone nuclear warheads detonated in cascading chains, each explosion triggering the next. And the swarm's tightly packed formation became a liability as fire spread from ship to ship. And then there were the missiles, thousands of them, each one carrying payloads that the Velkari had banned centuries ago, because they were considered too cruel for civilized warfare. "What are those?" Sorath asked, pointing at the tactical display where clusters of swarm ships were dissolving into clouds of organic vapor. Kethral checked his instruments and felt his skin turn pale. "Acid warheads," he said, "designed to eat through biological material. And they appear to be targeting the swarm's command organisms specifically. The battle should have been over in minutes. 40 ships against 300,000. But the humans refused to follow the rules of probability. They fought like creatures possessed, each ship operating as an independent engine of destruction, while somehow coordinating perfectly with the others. And the swarm, which had never encountered resistance like this, began to falter. Then the boarding parties came swarm warrior organisms, each one a nightmare of blades and teeth, designed by evolution for the sole purpose of killing, breached the hull of the constellation and poured into its corridors. Expecting to find easy prey, what they found instead was Sergeant Maria Santos and the 144th Heavy Infantry. "Contact front." Santos screamed into her helmet radio, her voice carrying over the sound of gunfire and alien shrieks. "Give them everything." The humans did not run from the monsters flooding their ship, and they did not try to seal off compartments or vent atmosphere to kill the invaders. They met the swarm face to face, in corridors so narrow that both sides had to climb over the bodies of the fallen to reach each other. Santos had lost her left arm 3 years ago in a mining accident, and the replacement the military had given her was designed for heavy lifting, not combat, but she had modified it herself, adding a plasma cutter to the forearm and reinforcing the fingers until they could punch through steel. Now she used that arm to tear through swarm warriors, her squad fighting beside her with weapons that ranged from standard rifles to improvised flamethrowers built from welding equipment. "They just keep coming," one of her soldiers shouted. "Then we keep killing." Santos shouted back, "And if you run out of ammo, use your knife. And if you lose your knife, use your teeth, because these things are not taking our ship." Across the fleet, similar scenes played out in every vessel the swarm tried to board on the Fury of Chicago. A retired engineer named Thomas Park held a corridor alone for 17 minutes, with nothing but a fire axe and a pressure suit. his artificial legs allowing him to brace himself against the deck in ways no natural human could match on the Relentless. The ship's cook, a woman named Yuki Tanaka, who had lost her voice to chemical burns in a factory accident, fought silently alongside the Marine detachment, her cybernetic throat implant broadcasting tactical data to her teammates while her hands worked a shotgun with mechanical precision. And on the bridge of the Constellation, Admiral Webb watched the battle unfold with his artificial eye, while his organic one tracked the movements of the swarm's command ship's navigation. He said calmly, "Bring us about to heading 77 Mark III and engineering. I need everything you can give me to the forward batteries." "Sir," his first officer said, "the swarm is concentrating on our position. We have 30,000 ships converging on us." Webb smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Good," he said. "That means they are not attacking the planet, and gunnery when they get in range. Show them what the Constellation can do when she is angry." The old ship groaned as it turned, its patched hull protesting the strain, but it held together as it always had. And when the swarm vessels came into range, the Constellation unleashed a broadside that turned 1,000 bioships into expanding clouds of debris. On the observation deck, Cathro watched the battle in stunned silence as the impossible became real before his eyes. 6 hours into the engagement, the humans had lost only 3 ships, while the swarm had lost over 40,000. How is this possible? A whispered Admiral Sarth stood beside him, his crystal armor reflecting the distant explosions like a prism catching sunlight. "I have studied military tactics for 200 years, Soros said slowly, "and I have never seen anything like this." "Because they are not fighting to win, Ambassador." He turned to face Cathro, and his eyes held something that might have been fear or might have been awe. "They are fighting like creatures who have already accepted death and decided that if they must die, they will take as many enemies with them as possible. And the swarm does not know how to respond to prey that attacks instead of running." A new sound began to emerge from the human communication channels, something that made Cathral's translators struggle to find an equivalent in the Valkyrie language. It was singing. The human crews were singing, their voices carrying across the void as they fought and bled and died. Battle hymns from 100 different cultures blending together into a wall of defiant sound. The crew of a destroyer called the Spirit of Shanghai was singing something in an ancient Earth language as their ship, its engines failing and its hull breached in a dozen places, turned toward the largest swarm carrier in the enemy formation. "What are they doing?" Cathral asked. The destroyer accelerated, its remaining weapons firing continuously, and the singing grew louder as the ship closed the distance. "They are ramming," Soros said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Spirit of Shanghai struck the carrier at full speed, and the resulting explosion destroyed both ships along with everything within 1,000 kilometers. And as the light faded, Cathral could still hear the echo of singing in his ears. This was not a battle. He realized this was a statement. The humans were telling the swarm, and the galaxy, and anyone else who might be watching, that they would not go quietly into the dark, and they would not surrender, and they would not stop fighting until either they were dead or their enemies were on the Constellation. Admiral Webb watched another wave of swarm ships approach and smiled his cold, joyless smile. "All ships," he said, "prepare for Phase 2, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the swarm overmind felt something it had never felt in 1,000,000,000 years of consumption and conquest. It felt doubt. For 1,000,000,000 years, the swarm had moved through the universe like a force of nature, consuming everything in its path, and in all that time, it had never encountered anything it could not eventually overwhelm it, had devoured civilizations that commanded the power of stars, and it had consumed species that had achieved what lesser beings called godhood. and it had grown fat on the flesh of 17 different forms of intelligent life in this galaxy alone. But now, for the first time in its ancient existence, the swarm overmind felt something new stirring in the vast network of consciousness that connected its billions of component organisms. It felt confusion. And beneath that confusion, something even more unfamiliar. The small gray ship should have been destroyed in the first minutes of contact, and the soft fleshy creatures inside them should have been easy prey for the warrior organisms, bred specifically to tear apart resistance instead. The humans were winning, not just surviving, not just holding their ground, but actively pushing back against a force that outnumbered them 7,000 to 1. Overmind redirected its attention to the battle, seeing through the eyes of 10,000 warrior organisms at once as they fought their way through the corridors of human ships. And what it saw disturbed it in ways it could not fully understand. The humans did not behave like prey when a warrior organism cornered a human soldier. The human did not try to flee or beg for mercy, and instead the human attacked, screaming battle cries in their strange language while fighting with whatever weapon they had available. One human, a female with metal replacing half her body, had killed 17 warrior organisms with a tool designed for cutting metal before she finally fell. And even as she died, she triggered an explosive device that killed 30 more. Another human, his legs destroyed by a swarm blade, had continued fighting from the ground, his artificial arms holding a weapon steady as he provided cover for his retreating comrades. And when the humans died, the others did not run. They fought harder. The overmind could not comprehend this behavior because it violated every rule of survival that governed the universe. Organisms were supposed to flee when faced with overwhelming force, and they were supposed to surrender when escape was impossible. And they were supposed to value their individual existence above all else. But these humans seemed to value something else more, something the overmind could not identify. And that unknown factor made them unpredictable in ways that disrupted all of its tactical calculations outside the ships. The space battle had become a nightmare of fire and death. The human vessels moved through the swarm fleet like predators, not prey, and their weapons never seemed to run empty. Overmind directed its sensor organisms to analyze the human ships more closely and discovered something that sent ripples of unease through its collective consciousness. The humans were building ammunition during the battle. Their ships contained fabrication systems that could convert raw materials into weapons, and they were actively mining the debris of destroyed swarm vessels, processing the organic matter into fuel and metal into bullets. They were using the swarm's own bodies to kill more of the swarm. The overmind had consumed species that grew their weapons and species that built their weapons, but it had never encountered a species that could do both simultaneously. In the middle of active combat, it tried to adapt its tactics, spreading its forces out to prevent the chain reactions caused by the human nuclear weapons. But this only made its ships easier targets for the railgun rounds that punched through armor like it was not there. It tried to focus all its forces on a single human ship, but the other human vessels would immediately move to support their ally, and the concentrated firepower of even 5 or 6 human ships working together was enough to destroy thousands of swarm vessels in seconds. And always, there was the singing. The human crew sang as they fought, their voices carrying across every communication frequency. And the overmind could not understand why they would waste energy on producing sounds that served no tactical purpose. It analyzed the songs, searching for hidden commands or coded messages, but found only expressions of defiance and references to concepts like honor and sacrifice and love. The overmind did not understand love. It understood hunger and growth and the imperative to consume. But love was an alien concept, a weakness that should have made these humans easy to defeat instead. It seemed to make them stronger 12 hours into the battle. The swarm had lost 150,000 ships, nearly half its total force, and the humans had lost only 7 ships, crewed by broken soldiers with obsolete equipment, had killed half an army that had conquered 17 civilizations. The Overmind felt the unknown emotion, growing stronger in its collective consciousness, and it finally recognized what it was: fear. For the first time in a billion years, the swarm was afraid. It reached out through space, broadcasting on frequencies it had never used before, attempting to communicate with the creatures that were systematically destroying its fleet. "What are you?" the Overmind screamed into the void. The response came from the largest human ship, the one called Constellation, and it was not a scream but a calm statement delivered in the voice of the human called Webb. "We are humanity," the human said, "and you made a mistake when you came to this galaxy. We have consumed gods," the Overmind replied. "We have eaten civilizations that commanded the power of stars. So how can you, a species barely out of your cradle, hope to defeat us?" There was a pause, and then the human spoke again, and something in his voice made the Overmind's fear deepen. "Let me tell you about our cradle," Webb said. "Earth is a death world, and everything on it has been trying to kill everything else for 4 billion years. And the species that survived are the ones that learned to fight back. We survived ice ages that froze our world, and we survived asteroids that burned the sky, and we survived plagues that killed 90% of our population, and every single time, we got back up and kept going. We are the children of a planet that tried to kill us every single day of our existence. And instead of dying, we conquered it. We did not achieve space travel because we were peaceful or wise. And we did not join the galactic community because we were ready. We clawed our way to the stars using nuclear fire and sheer stubborn refusal to accept limits. And every species we have met has told us to be patient, to accept our place, to wait our turn. But here is what none of you understand about humanity. The Constellation turned, its battered hull facing the Overmind's central command nexus, and every weapon on the ship began to glow with charging energy. "We do not wait," Webb said, "and we do not accept our place. And when something threatens the people we have chosen to protect, we do not stop fighting until either we are dead or the threat is gone." You asked what we are. The Constellation fired, its main cannon releasing a beam of energy that struck the Overmind's command nexus like the fist of an angry god. "We are the species that looked at a universe full of things trying to kill us and said, 'Not today.' And we have been saying it for 4 billion years. And we will keep saying it until the stars burn out. Now hold still while we finish what you started." The command nexus exploded, and the Overmind felt a piece of itself die. And with that death came a realization that shook its billion-year-old consciousness to its core. It could not win this fight, not because the humans were more numerous or more technologically advanced, but because they simply would not stop. The Overmind could destroy every ship in their fleet, and the humans would keep fighting from the debris. It could kill every soldier, and the dying would use their last breath to detonate whatever weapons they had left. It could consume their entire species. And with its final thought, the last human alive would be trying to find a way to take the Overmind with them. There was no victory against an enemy like this, only mutual destruction. And the swarm, despite its hunger, despite its billion years of conquest, was not ready to die for the first time in its existence. The swarm Overmind gave an order it had never given before: retreat. The remaining ships turned away from the battle, fleeing into the darkness between stars and behind them. The human fleet did not pursue. They had made their point on the observation deck of the orbital station. Ambassador Kethrol watched the swarm retreat and felt tears running down his translucent skin. The impossible had happened. 40 ships and a few thousand broken. Soldiers had done what no force in the galaxy had ever accomplished. They had made the swarm afraid. 3 weeks after the Battle of Valkyrie Prime, Ambassador Kethril stood once again before the Galactic Assembly. But this time, everything was different. The chamber was packed with delegates from every known species, many of whom had never bothered to attend sessions before. And the air hummed with a tension that Kethril had never felt in this place of ancient diplomacy. They had all seen the footage every civilization in the galaxy had watched recordings of 40 battered human ships charging into a fleet of 300,000. And they had seen the nuclear fire and the railgun rounds and the missiles that dissolved living ships into vapor. And they had heard the singing. The singing had disturbed them most of all. Species that had never understood music now found themselves unable to stop thinking about those human voices raised in defiance. And species that had considered themselves the apex predators of their regions looked at the footage of human soldiers fighting swarm warriors in hand-to-hand combat and felt something uncomfortable stirring in their ancient hearts. Kethril stepped to the central podium, and the chamber fell silent. 3 weeks ago, he began, I stood in this very spot and begged for help. And most of you looked away because you were afraid of the swarm. And I do not blame you for that fear, because I felt it too. He paused and looked around at the assembled delegates, but one species did not look away. And they sent help, and I want to tell you what that help accomplished. He activated the holographic display, and the chamber filled with numbers and images. The swarm arrived at Valkyrie Prime with approximately 300,000 bioships, representing the largest single force it had ever deployed against any target. And my people's fleet of 1,200 crystal vessels was prepared to fight and die in a hopeless last stand. He gestured at the display. The human Third Reserve fleet arrived with 40 ships, crewed by veterans who their own military considered too damaged for frontline service. And these ships were old, some of them older than the humans who served on them. And they were armed with weapons that most species in this chamber would consider primitive. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, and Kethril saw many of them exchanging glances. In 23 hours of continuous combat, the human fleet destroyed 212,000 swarm vessels. The number hung in the air, and Kethril let it sink in before continuing. Human casualties numbered 11 ships destroyed and 19 damaged, with approximately 2,800 personnel killed or wounded. He paused again. They lost fewer soldiers than many of your species lose in training accidents. A murmur ran through the chamber, and the crystalline elder raised one of its light-focusing appendages to request attention. Ambassador, the elder said, his voice resonating through the translation systems. These numbers are remarkable, but surely the humans suffered significant damage to their surviving vessels, and their remaining crews must be exhausted. Kethril smiled, and he was surprised to find that it was a genuine expression. I asked Admiral Webb that same question, he said, and his response was interesting. He pulled up another recording, and Admiral Webb's scarred face appeared on the display. Damage report? Webb said in the recording, half my ships need new armor plating, and the Constellation is going to need a complete engine overhaul. But we should be combat ready again in about 2 weeks. And your crews? Kethril's voice asked from off-screen. Webb laughed his rough, gravelly laugh. My people are fine, he said. This was actually pretty light compared to some of the things we have been through. And half of them are already asking when we can go after the swarm and finish the job. The recording ended, and Kethril faced the assembly once more. The humans sent their reserves, he said slowly. Their third reserves, staffed by soldiers too broken for their primary military and equipped with ships too old for their main fleet. He let that statement hang in the air, and those reserves destroyed 2/3 of a swarm fleet that had conquered 17 civilizations. The Retheni delegate, the massive creature of stone and fire, spoke for the first time. "Ambassador, you said the humans told you their primary forces were engaged elsewhere. So what exactly are those primary forces engaged in?" Catherall nodded, because this was the question he had been waiting for. I asked Commander Chun that same question before she departed, and she was kind enough to show me some footage from something the humans call the hegemony border conflict. He activated another recording. She described it as a minor skirmish that had been going on for about 3 years. The footage began to play, and the assembly watched in silence. The first image showed a human dreadnought. Not the battered vessels of the Third Reserve, but a gleaming mountain of metal and weapons that dwarfed anything the Valkyrie had ever built. And this ship was surrounded by hundreds of others just like it. "This is their 4th fleet," Catherall said. "One of 12 primary combat fleets maintained by the United Earth military. And it is currently engaged in what the humans consider a defensive action against the hegemony." The footage shifted to show the 4th Fleet in combat, and the delegates watched as human dreadnoughts tore through enemy formations with weapons that made the 3rd Reserve's arsenal look like children's toys. The final clip showed a single human vessel, designated as the U.E.'s Thunderchild, approaching a moon that was being used as an enemy staging ground. This footage is from what the humans describe as a training exercise. Catherall said, "The Thunderchild fired once, and the moon cracked in half, its debris scattering through space as billions of enemy soldiers died in an instant." The recording ended, and the chamber was absolutely silent. "The humans have been among the stars for 60 years, Catherall said. "And in that time, they have smiled politely, traded fairly, and done everything we asked of them." He looked around the chamber at the stunned faces of 100 different species. "They sent their weakest when we called for help, and their weakest made the swarm flee in terror." He stepped back from the podium. "I believe they have been holding back, and I believe they have been doing it on purpose, because they did not want to frighten us." The crystalline elder spoke, and its voice was quieter than Catherall had ever heard it. "If this is true, Ambassador, then why are you telling us? Because surely the humans did not want this information shared." "Actually," a voice came from the back of the chamber, "we do not mind at all." Every head turned to see Commander Sarah Chun standing on the human delegation's platform, wearing the same gray uniform and the same polite smile she had worn 3 weeks ago. "The Third Reserve's performance at Valkyrie Prime was always going to be noticed," she said. "And we decided it was better for you to hear the truth from your own people than to learn it through rumors and speculation." She stepped forward, and despite her small size, every delegate in the chamber found themselves paying close attention to her words. "Humanity has been patient," she said, "and we have been polite. And we have accepted our role as the youngest species in the galactic community because we understood that trust must be earned. But the swarm changed things when Ambassador Catherall asked for help. 17 other species said no because they were afraid. And I do not blame them for being afraid, because fear is a rational response to a threat you cannot defeat." She paused and looked around the chamber. "But humanity has never let fear stop us from doing what needed to be done. And when we saw people who were about to be destroyed simply because no one else was willing to help, we decided that our patience had limits. So yes, we sent our reserves, and yes, they accomplished something that the galaxy considered impossible. And now you all know what the Third Reserve can do." Her polite smile widened slightly, and something in her eyes made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Imagine what our best can do." The chamber was silent as Chun returned to her seat, and Catherall watched the expressions of the assembled delegates, seeing fear and awe and something else. Something that looked almost like hope, because if the weakest humans could make the swarm flee, then perhaps the galaxy was not as helpless as they had believed. Perhaps There was a species out there that would stand between the darkness and the innocent. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. Ambassador Kethril looked at Commander Chun one last time, and she caught his eye and gave him a small nod. He thought about everything he had seen in the past 3 weeks. The ugly ships and the broken soldiers and the impossible courage that had saved his people. The humans had taught the galaxy a lesson. And it was a lesson that Kethril would never forget. When the darkness comes and all hope seems lost, pray that humanity sends help, but pray even harder that they send their strongest, because if they send their weakest, it means they are saving the strong for something else, and whatever that something else might be. The swarm had learned the hard way that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. The session ended, and as the delegates filed out, many of them glanced at the human platform with new eyes, seeing not the young children they had always dismissed, but something far more dangerous and far more valuable, an ally worth having, and an enemy no one wanted to make. In the back of the chamber, Commander Sarah Chun smiled her polite smile and made a note to inform Earth that first contact with the galactic community was proceeding exactly